All rise for the pledge of
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So moving to consideration of the agenda, for this evening, we are going to pick up where we thought we would be at the meeting on January 10th, but we didn't have the video teleconferencing capability. Also, we were short a couple of planning members for that meeting, and so we felt that it was prudent so that the public could participate to reschedule the meeting, and of course that date is this evening. So the agenda is a pretty straightforward agenda. We had a couple of long reports, but the vast majority of the new business was related to the annual report and zoning ordinance amendment for signs, 2023 meeting calendar. And the only thing I would say is that when we get into the new business, the one item that I believe we should discuss further is the process for how we continue our review of the zoning ordinance. We had a lot of discussion in our last meeting, the last full meeting that we had. So, but the agenda is pretty straightforward. Is there any questions or consideration about the agenda that needs to be changed? If not, may I have a motion to approve the agenda as documented?
I'll second.
Discussion?
Laura.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, so moving forward, is there anyone with the Planning Commission that feels they have a conflict of interest with any items on this agenda this evening?
No.
Hearing none, we'll move on to the approval of the meeting minutes from November 10th. I thought that that the minutes were well done. It was a pretty comprehensive and pretty complex topic. There was a lot of going back. There was one aspect of it that I wanted to bring forward for the commission's consideration. When I recall the discussion, the minutes kind of seemed to impart that we agreed that we were not going to use the draft of that was put forward by the steering committee. And so I agreed that we were going to start with the process that we are tonight. We were going to start with signs. We were going to continue to review through the document, through the draft that was prepared by the steering committee, and go through the most relevant sessions to make sure we address the pertinent things as quickly as possible. However, at least in my mind, I did not conclude that we wouldn't necessarily hold off and review that document later. I felt that we would spend our time going through it, see where it goes, try to come up with a process to see if we could get a better comfort level of all the context around it. And then we might consider coming back and continuing that review process. What do others members remember, and how do they think about it? Barbara?
Yeah, I remember that we said we were not going to use this draft at all we were not going to review the zoning ordinance at all until we had redone the master plan. The only thing we were going to do is anything that had to be amended because of the law had changed or for some other technical reason, we would take those up first, which is why the signs ordinance came up first. Anyway, that's the way I remember it. I don't remember that we were going to meticulously go through this draft zoning ordinance and use that as a basis for our discussions.
Denise, how do you remember it?
That's pretty close. I thought we were definitely going to pursue the ones that legally you could have some kind of problem. So address those first. clarify my understanding of what you two are saying. I don't think we're saying throw this all out. But I think our main focus, after we address the ones that there is some concern with, in terms of legal liability, is that our major focus is the master plan. That is how I understand.
Okay. Laura, what do you remember? Excuse me, what do you recollect?
I plan on coming here and going over signs, and not that we would be going over the proposed rewrite, but signs would be the topic because we have to do something about it. And I just assumed maybe that we would be using the draft that Sarah provided as a starting point because she knows that would keep us out of trouble, which is where we need to be.
Okay. And then unfortunately, we don't have Bill or Kevin or Jason here to comment about what they recall. So I'm good with the minutes as they are drafted. I would say that, it wasn't as clear in my head, but I felt that none of us had the context that we needed to go through and evaluate the proposed draft until we had a chance to dive into it further. And so it was a lot of change. We talked about potential processes for how do we get some red lines to compare the old to the new, and what would be some methods around that. And maybe part of it was my confidence that as we got into it, we might feel more comfortable as we started reviewing it. And I do recall Sarah making some comments that as you look at some of these features of the current ordinance and the complexities around making them comply legally, that it becomes very intertwined very quickly, and then you end up into a spot where it's almost very difficult to compare even red lines. So in other words, the complexity around changing the current to making it legally compliant would get very, very confusing as we get into it. So Sarah, I guess I'd pause and ask you if that's what you had said, something similar to that.
Yeah, and that's what signs, is kind of an easy one. It's in one section of the ordinance. It's easy to make amendments. But when we start talking about definitions or some language in the ordinance or consistency throughout, that's where we really can get into an issue where we're trying to make it better and we almost make it worse by trying to improve upon it. So I would agree with your statement, Andy.
Okay. So are there other changes to the minutes, or any changes to the minutes at this point?
I have one, Andy. The bottom of the first page under 9A, the last sentence says the need for a review became evident back in 2018. And I believe they're talking there about a review of the zoning ordinance, but that wasn't evident back in 2018. I don't get the connection between 2018 and the statement that the zoning ordinance needs to be reviewed. I mean, I'm not sure what happened in 2018.
Is that when we started to butt up against some things not being legit?
I have no idea.
I'm not sure where that comes from, unless it was related to be saying that, the sign language from case law from 2015. That's the only thing I could think of that I might have said at that same time.
I don't know, but because I understand that this zoning or the sign ordinance was amended in 2021? No, 2000.
I think what he might be referring to here, I read that in context for the survey that led to the master plan. Isn't that what that's in regard to? Not necessarily specific to the ordinance, zoning ordinance.
I don't know. I don't know what
Okay.
was what was decided it needed to be reviewed back in 2018. Was it the master plan? Was it the zoning ordinance? Was it a particular part of the zoning ordinance? I have no idea.
I mean,
But I don't remember that being the case, anything being said about that. And if they're talking about the master plan, I think that's wrong, because I think that is when we adopted the master plan. It was in 2018.
Whoa.
So as
So
soon as we
maybe-
adopted it, then we said it's not good enough?
Right.
I mean, I don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could do, they're your minutes, but I think you could strike that sentence without causing any impact on the, it's just a discussion item anyways, it's not a motion. But to be able to get the minutes approved without having to go back and review that, I don't know that it's that pertinent in the discussion personally. But if you want us to go back and check the exact, what the date or what that was in reference to, we can do that.
If you just strike it, then I don't have a problem with it.
I think we should strike it,
It's just ambiguous.
because you're right, even if it was accurate, it doesn't
Right, doesn't do anything.
do anything. Any other changes? May I have a motion to approve the minutes with the edit of striking that last sentence under point 13?
Point 13.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes with the striking of the final sentence under 9A on the first page. The one reading, "The need for review became evident back in 2018."
Well, full discussion, so I'm going to discuss, because maybe I'm looking at the packet that I had from last time, and there was clearly a 13 under public comment. Isn't that the section you were talking about?
No.
Maybe I was looking at the wrong section.
9A.
9A at the very bottom.
Oh, that's why I'm confused then. Okay. Okay, that's helpful then. Then I was looking at the wrong piece. So tell me now I'm confused. So which section are we?
9A. at the
There we
very
go. I
bottom
got
of
it. The
last.
need for review back in 2018. Okay. Okay, and I was looking at item 13, the last sentence, prior to 2018. That's where the confusion came, so, okay. So I'm still comfortable striking that last sentence of item 9A. So, all in favor of making that change, the minutes and approving them?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay. Minutes are approved. So we open it up for public comments relevant to tonight's agenda items.
Just as a housekeeping suggestion.
Could you please
Bill,
state your name?
can I get your
Sorry.
card too?
I will.
And
You
your-
haven't got a chance yet.
Thank
William
you.
Stridiron, beautiful downtown Eastport. As housekeeping goes, because we have a lot of new members on the planning commission, just a reminder that these new members need to complete the Michigan State Planning course within 1 year by the bylaws of the planning commission. So I would put it on you, Mr. Chair, to follow up on that if you would. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments this evening?
What would it be without the supervisor stopping by, right? Good evening, Bob Cook, Supervisor, Torch Lake Township, 12110 Dragonfly Lane, Kuwaitan. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to make the November meeting to help kick this off. I had illness, but I'm glad to be here today. Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask in advance for a couple of extra minutes if needed.
Please.
Okay, thank you. My purpose is to give you a historical perspective on why we are here today. It all started in January of 2021. Our planner had resigned earlier, and we needed a new one. And Beckett and Rader was hired as our planner. Sarah was assigned to our township. One thing that impressed the team that interviewed the candidates was that Beckett and Rader took a look at our ordinances and determined that there was some work to be done on them. In April, we outsourced the zoning administrator role to Beckett and Rader, with Sarah taking that role on as well. In May, Steve Langworthy conducted a training session with members of the PC, ZBA, and Township Board with regards to our ordinances in the first part of the meeting, and then as to the responsibilities and roles of the ZBA and PC for the members of those groups. During that discussion, Steve was not very complimentary with regards to our zoning ordinance. After the meeting, I asked Steve what I needed to do for the township. He indicated, rewrite the ordinances and hire Beckett and Rader to do it. Mr. Langworthy is a well-known expert in the state of Michigan as it relates to zoning ordinances. We have used him extensively during the rezoning application at Torchport Airport in the past year, as some of you know from the Planning Commission. I took Steve's advice and began conducting discussions with Beckett and Rader for a contract. In June, the board approved the contract, and part of the contract was for the township to establish a steering committee to work with Sarah. The vote was 4-1. Mr. Martell voted no and stated that the ordinances were fine with some minor changes. That is consistent with his recent letter to the PC. I wrote to Steve regarding Alan's comments. I will read the emails to you. I wrote, Steve, the board approved the contract with Beckett and Rader to redo our ordinances. During the discussion, I received pushback from certain members who seemed to indicate there were only minor changes required and that it could be accomplished in-house with Sarah's help. His response to me was, Bob, thanks for your request. First, I can assure you that there are significant changes in language, format, and legal requirements that will be needed. I even told Sarah that if she found, as I did, that there are so many changes that she would stop the review and come back to the commission with a rewrite recommendation and use the funds on the rewrite rather than the full analysis. As I went through it, I believe I would have had in some chapters almost as many pages of comments as there were in the ordinance. The changes are going to be many and complex in some cases. The discussion on the sign regulation is but one example of the legal and technical issues involved. Ordinances like these are too technical and require a broad range of knowledge of zoning issues and regulations. After the first couple of meetings, as a team, it was decided to move forward with a total rewrite, keeping any existing ordinance, not requiring changes. Based on Mr. Langworthy's comment, my takeaway was we were on the right path. In July of 21, I proposed the creation and nominated a slate of members for the steering committee to the board. The vote approving the steering committee was 5-0. Notice Mr. Martell approved the steering committee. The steering committee had representation from the PC, Laura Carlton, the ZB chairwoman, Laura Anderson, the township board, Jason Merchant, as well as a prior chairperson, Lee Scott. I want to thank them again for their service to the community in that project. September of 21, we began the work. We completed the steering committee's efforts on July 27th of 2022. Sarah completed her work in the fall. You have her finished work in front of you. One additional item to address, the master plan. I hear a lot of that. I reached out to Mr. Langworthy, and here is his comment related to that. Bob, obviously we'd prefer to have the master plan come first, but sometimes the zoning ordinance is so demanding of change that it can't wait. And doing it now reduces the areas of emphasis that will need to be addressed after the plan is done. To be clear, the Planning Commission has sole authority to decide what their path will be on these two items. Now, to address the comments of Mr. Kalka and Mr. Martell, they have every right to express their opinions. But over the course of 9+ meetings of the steering committee, never once did these gentlemen attend a meeting. Nor during the course of 16 board meetings did they use citizen or board comment to address their continued concerns with the steering committee and its work. Silence during all this time. So why now? They will have opportunities during the public hearing phase to provide their input to you with regards to the zoning ordinances you are reviewing. I checked with Sarah. The process we followed does not violate any established rules of the Zoning Enabling Act. We followed the proper notification requirements and recorded all of the meetings. Poor Michael Strange had to sit through all those meetings during the recording. I've told Andy that I estimate it will take you a year to go through this with the public hearings. I hope that the commission can achieve a quicker timetable, but it's critical for our community that you get it right. The township has invested money and individuals' time to get a set of zoning ordinances that are clear, concise, and reflect the values of our community. One last comment. I wanted to thank Sarah and Jackie for their hard work and dedication in running our zoning office. Sarah's 17 years of zoning experience has helped us through a number of issues, and her work is greatly appreciated. I want to thank you in advance for the work that you are about to undertake and for your service on the Planning Commission. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments this evening? Since there's no one else in the audience, I'm assuming no. So next on the agenda is ongoing reports. The zoning administrator will start with you, Sarah.
Sure. So you did receive a copy of all of last year's permits and all of that information. On your desk tonight is an update just for the month of January so far to add to that, or to start over, however you want to look at it. New year, new report. So these are what we're working on right now.
Any uptick in trends, one way or the other?
No, I haven't seen, I mean, about the time you say something's changing, something else changes. So no, not really. We have been dealing a little bit more in enforcement as far as ticketing. So we do have a couple of tickets out there and a hearing on some of the tickets for enforcement items. Typically, a lot of our enforcement we can get corrected without having to get all the way to a ticket. But we just, have a couple situations where we have to go a little bit further than that. So.
Any questions for Sarah on her report?
And I guess I want to mention, you did receive an email maybe at the beginning of the month related to a court case that we have, and not to destroy anything. I would doubt that the Planning Commission would have any information that's related to a zoning board of appeals case. So it's highly unlikely that you would have something unless for some reason somebody emailed you directly related to that. So you don't need to worry about it unless something like that happened. But
Okay, thank you. The next two are the PC representative to the ZBA and the Township Board representative on the PC. Neither one of them are here this evening.
yeah, so the ZBA canceled their meeting last week because the applicant requested to have it rescheduled to when they could have 5 members present. So that's going to happen at the February 15th meeting.
Okay. Any other questions about ongoing reports? Hearing none. Do we have any correspondence this evening?
No.
Okay. In front of you, there is a copy. Mr. Martell was here and he handed a copy of the letter or memo that he wrote prior to our last meeting. So it's the same item. He just brought it up, hard copy this evening.
He handed out hard copies of it.
Yes, he did.
Do we have a copy for the file of that? Okay.
Yeah, there's also an extra one here.
Is there an extra one?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so moving into the new business part of our agenda, start with the annual report.
So annually, the planning commission is required to provide an annual report to the township board. This is in similar format to the report you approved last year. So we just started with that and kind of gave a quick overview of what was worked on last year and where we're headed. And as I mentioned in the memo, also a good time to tell the board any, budget requests or projects that you want to work on. So I guess this would be a good time to discuss, and it kind of follows up on what you talked about during the minutes, Andy, too, if it's going to be more work on the master plan. So we'll need to try to get money allocated for that in the budget, or zoning ordinance or kind of that component. So I think that'd be part of the discussion in here. I wrote the report is that the zoning ordinance was kind of going on the side, and we were going to move towards master plan discussion, is how I intended the annual report to read.
And so just to be clear, so this report is for work completed. Is this a fiscal year or is it annual, the time period covered?
The state law just says an annual report. It doesn't tell you how that report functions. So I do it on a calendar year because the budget runs through March 31st. So it's your annual report coming out calendar runs right into the budget for funding next year.
Okay. Commission members, any questions on this particular report?
I believe that was something that came out of the last annual report because there was talk about it. The looking forward is kind of similar as to what you were looking forward to last year as well, but we didn't quite get there. So I think that that's just a number that's thrown out there. I would say that that's based on the planning commission in the discussions that have been had, want to do a lot of community engagement. And when you go through community engagement and you look at that component, that can take up a lot of time and money in your budget to do it. So this may be a little bit higher than you would see in maybe other communities of similar size and demographics. But a lot of times with a lesser budget, we have a survey. We may only do a survey, or you may have a survey in one open house. This budget, and not saying that that's what it would be, we can figure out what the scope is. Definitely takes into consideration, an open house, multiple, maybe smaller workshops or open houses, or even some stakeholder, where you'd invite certain people to participate in a topic, or a survey and maybe some sort of follow-up. So it kind of is giving that window to discuss that type of a scope, I guess. Yeah, I mean, we can put an unlimited amount, but I think that we can get you a pretty good plan for that amount. I might have to manage your expectations a little bit at a certain time, but once we get into scope talk, then I can help narrow that down.
Okay, good.
So,
Two other aspects to that too is one is that we will not be done with the master plan in 2023.
Right.
So some of the budgeted items are going to carry into next year. So it's really, what are we going to do this year and next year? So we don't have to consider all of it and budget all of it for this year. In fact, I don't think it would be prudent to do so. The other aspect is we still do have a lot of work to do on the zoning ordinances, regardless of which process we go. If we continue forward and reviewing the signs and so on, these other items, it's going to take us a number of months. So we are, going to be busy with that. So that will unfold as we move ahead. So
I did have one thing I forgot about on that report. Can we make it maybe more clear, just, thinking ourselves looking back with the list of projects that went before the PC? Only that one, the denial of the dollar store general, is called out as a denial. Just would be good to maybe say that the others were approved.
sure.
Cool, thank you.
because it could be as simple as planning commission reviewed and approved.
Yep.
Good catch. And I would say also in the looking forward section, we insert a comment that the planning commission will work on the zoning ordinance and, begin efforts on the master plan, something like that. When I read that, it appears like we're not going to do much with the zoning ordinance,
Okay.
but we are clearly.
So something about we'll work on zoning ordinance amendments that maybe need immediate attention or something like that?
Yes, and then review of the document.
Yep.
For sure. And Sarah, when do we have to have this? We have to have this submitted by March?
When, the township board's already talking about budget, they've kind of already went through a lot of their work sessions already. So, I mean, the supervisor's aware of what the planning commission is looking for. I don't know where the budget process is completely for that. But this would be something, I mean, we'd want to get to the township board in the near future. There's no deadline on it. So if you want to take another month to see what I've added to it, you can. If you're comfortable moving forward with approval with a couple of changes, I can forward it to the board right away. It's completely up to you.
How do the other commission members feel about that? My view is that we wait until we get, because we're missing 3 members. I would like their input on it and see if there's anything, because it is a reflection of everything for the year. While in some respects it's pretty straightforward, feels like technically we could vote on it now, but I'd rather have input. And I think we're going to be having more special meetings here shortly anyway, so.
Yeah, that is something to take into consideration too, as you're working through zoning amendments and if you want to work on the master plan as well. I don't think you're going to get much master plan work done at the same time as your zoning amendments. So we'll have to figure out what that looks like and how that works. If it's where you have special meetings that just work on one topic, or if you want to work with some sort of a subcommittee of the whole to kind of help work through some of the master plan things. So it's not as much at the planning commission level. That will be something, because I don't want the planning commission to get burnt out either. I know having a bunch of meetings to go over documents and that. So we'll need to find out a good way to be able to move both kind of processes forward at the same time.
Okay. So do we need to vote on pushing that off, or we can just move on?
Just by consensus, if everybody's comfortable waiting till next month, that's fine.
Okay, so Commissioner, you good with waiting until next meeting to approve this? Or do you feel strongly to approve it now?
You're going to guarantee us that there are going to be more members here next time?
I'm not going to guarantee anything.
I don't have a problem with putting it off.
Everybody's, okay, looks like we have consensus, so we'll move on to the next item. So let's go into zoning ordinance amendment
Sure.
and signs. But I would like to spend a little bit of time on process before we get into this. Because after our last meeting, not the one that was canceled, because that technically wasn't a meeting, right? Or I guess it was a very short one.
Right.
It was a very short one. But the meeting where we did discuss this at great length, I placed a call to Steve Langworthy. And because I did want to get his perspective on how he looked at, because he was pretty familiar with a lot of things that had happened. He was familiar with the steering committee. He was familiar with, obviously, activity at the air park. He was also very, had a sense for, had looked through our ordinance or was familiar with it. And just to get his take on it. And, I asked him several questions. And the first question I had was, what is his position or view on our current amendment? And he felt pretty clearly that it needed to be redone. He had said that, does that mean just make changes to it, where it's obviously there's some issues that we know that need to be brought up to date from a legal perspective, but beyond the context. And he felt that it was beyond making edits. He felt a rewrite was the more appropriate type of approach. And so we discussed that for a little bit. And then I asked him his view and perspective on working on it and like in a more comprehensive way before we do the work on the master plan. Because, and I had expressed reservations in our meeting about that. The ideal scenario, you would kind of use the master plan as our North Star when we're reviewing the zoning ordinance to make sure everything dovetailed together. And he did say that that would be certainly a better approach, but he felt that it was in our interest to move ahead with a more comprehensive rewrite sooner than later. And so then I asked, well, but if we do that and then we turn around and do the master plan, then, aren't we are we going to waste a lot of work doing that? And then we have to turn right around and redo the zoning ordinance again if we have changes in our master plan. And he said, well, you probably would have to. But he said the majority of the zoning ordinance we would be able to work through because it's kind of your nuts and bolts of administering aspects of your community. And while there could be some significant changes that come out of your master plan and you would have to reflect those in your ordinance, his feeling is that, we could proceed forward and it wouldn't be a lot of wasted effort in that. The last thing I asked him was, kind of his perspective on the signs in particular. And he said the sign ordinance that we currently have was definitely not in compliance, that we needed to change it. I asked him kind of in a nutshell what that was about. And he just explained that the gist of it is the content neutral type of aspect of how the zoning ordinance needs to be managed, and that it would require a significant rewrite to do so. And then I kind of looked at with that context and compared, and I'll come back to that in a second. And then the last thing, I'd asked him if he would be willing to document and share with us his perspectives on that or some kind of a process, because I can tell you it was very helpful for me. And I realized that I was the only one on that call. But it was helpful for me because, I've struggled, and I said early on when we had that first meeting that I struggled. We've got this master plan, we've got this gigantic change in document. It's hard to get the context and the familiarity with each of it, much less a particular section, but in the broad context, how do we get to that level? And, I guess hearing it from him, obviously we've already heard it from Sarah and Beckett and Rader. It was helpful. So one thing, we don't have to solve this tonight, but I wanted to share that with you, that I think it might be a good way to leverage him as we're going through this, because I think as we get into these sections, perhaps something we could consider is having him engage with us in some fashion, documenting his perspective, and then seeing how that makes us feel about the rewrite in relation to the current ordinance as we go through it. And maybe that can get us, moving on things a little bit. So any comments or questions about that?
Did he explain to you, I think you said the content neutral, the fact that the zoning ordinance sign provisions have to be, that the signs have to be, we cannot regulate the content. Content has to be, as far as we're concerned, the content is free speech. And so we don't mess with that. Is that what he talked about as well?
Yes, he did. And I could not do a good job of paraphrasing it other than that, I'm trying to think of the way he positioned it. It was like, you have to regulate signs, each like a particular size and shape. So it's kind of a type of sign that it is. You can't make rules and regulations around a particular sign as the type of content that's on it.
Right. Like
So-
you can't read the sign to determine what type of sign it is. So in our existing ordinance, you see where it calls out real estate signs and then it has regulations. And then it calls out
Yeah,
a different type of, so real estate, garage sales, those types of
developments,
signs.
like
Right.
developers.
You can't read the sign to determine what it is. You need to just call those temporary signs. They have to be treated the same. And that's what that court case from 2015 was about. It had to do with a church, and they were putting out signs and they were being treated differently than real estate signs. They were dealing in temporary signs, but they regulated those types of signage differently. And the US Supreme Court came back and said, you cannot treat them differently. It didn't have anything to do with, you know, religion and all of that, because that kind of muddies the water. But on a very basic level, it was, you can't read the sign to determine what type of sign it is. So that's why you'll see in like this section that I've put together, you've got freestanding sign. This is what is a freestanding sign. You have a wall sign or window sign, temporary signs, type of things, and you have on-premise and off-premise. So you're very broad, which sometimes make it difficult to kind of regulate some of the things you'd like to and some of the nuisances that you have with signage. But that's how just, I think the easiest way to look at it is, do I have to read the sign to be able to tell if it's a freestanding sign or if it's a wall sign? You shouldn't need to, because it's based on where it's located on the property or on the building.
I would say that after I had that conversation, then I looked at the draft that Sarah prepared, then I looked at our current one, and as soon as I started looking, I'm like, I get it now. It wasn't as obvious to me going into it. I kind of got it, but now it made clear sense. And so then it gave me a better perspective of looking at the new proposed ordinance versus the existing. And when I look at the existing, it feels to me like you would, there were 8 pages, I think, in the existing. And it looked like 5 of those 8 pages were specifically laid out by signs as they would be defined by what they read. So residential identification, realtor, as Sarah just put it, and so forth. So that's what made me lead to believe it would be hard to edit that, because basically all 5 of those pages would be completely, struck, or, it would be a complete redo. So.
And I think, even, I know you kind of wanted to talk broadly, but now that we're talking about signs, is that when trying to use the sign section of the ordinance as a zoning administrator, it's a very difficult section because it has types that overlap. So when you're looking at, let me pull up this current sign section that we have. You're looking at so signs that are required with a permit or allowed with a permit. You've got business identification sign, so that's an on-premise sign identifying the business. And then, which is B, it's on page 385. And then item C is advertising and display sign, so an on-premise sign that advertises goods and services offered or provided on the premise. So do you get both kinds of signs? You only get one kind of sign? To me, you would qualify to get a business identification sign that identifies your business, and then you get the advertising signs for what's offered on the property, which your original sign should do that as well. It just gets very kind of, where's the line when you're trying to deal in some of those items? And then also with our current sign ordinance and dealing with temporary signs, because our sign ordinance is not content neutral, we've been advised by the attorney to not do any enforcement on them, because we don't have clear rules on how to deal with a temporary sign that is content neutral. So right now, essentially, it's kind of a free-for-all. And, so that makes it so that we can't clean it up or regulate them very easily.
So before we dive into that, any other questions or thoughts about the conversation I had with Steve Langworthy?
And I guess I would like to mention, Andy, too, that Steve did have a chance to look at the draft before the committee looked at it. So I drafted it up, and then as the committee got sections, he kind of took an eye and just looked at it over. He didn't spend a ton of time going through concepts or things like that. And so some of his changes were already implemented into the draft that you see, because he took a look at it and provided that assistance to us. So, I think he'd have more ideas too, but just to let you know that he's familiar with the draft as well.
Okay, so why don't we do this, unless anybody's got further questions, let's dive into the sign section. One thing's for sure, we gotta deal with this now. And we'll kind of park Steve aside for the moment And then maybe we'll come back to that and see if there's a way that maybe we might be able to use him further in some of this as well. So, so Sarah, how would you recommend we go through this?
Sure. So if we want to get into science specific, I think we just walk through. So something I will tell you about the science section is that when we got to this during the steering committee discussion, the steering committee said, I don't want to touch this, send it to the planning commission and let them deal with it. So in that light, you can thank the steering committee for that one. And this is just a draft that I've put together, kind of my thoughts on it or discussions that we've had in the past. This is really kind of the first look at it. That's like with Township review to give me some idea on it. So I'm sure there'll be some good discussions as we go through it as well.
So
Don't get us wrong. We did read it and discuss it,
Right.
but there were things along the way that we noted as
Right.
definitely take this to the
Yeah,
PC.
and that has to do with, freestanding signs. How big should they be? How tall should they be? Should we include LED signs, electronic message signs as a sign allowed and things like that in that discussion? So I guess we can just start at the beginning with signs and kind of walk through it. And if you have any comments or questions or thoughts, let me know. This is your ordinance, so we'll try to make it work the best we can. The only thing I would encourage the planning commission to do is try not to get too far into wordsmithing. I'm looking for like general broad policies. So if there's something you don't like the way that it reads, for sure bring that up. But let's try to keep it a little bit broader than that as far as concepts and policies when we're working through this.
I just have one question before. So when you drafted this, did you have anything that you were working from? Was it based off of an ordinance you'd seen elsewhere and then you made changes knowing what you know about here, or how did that happen?
Yeah.
How did that work?
So some of the language is based off of either an ordinance that I've worked on, that I've tweaked. The sections that deal with the types of sign, freestanding and, that language, I was trying to pull from our current ordinance something that was similar to be a starting point. Other examples, I just said, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. This is something that works a little bit better or is more typical. So it's not just this is what they did next door. This is what you need to pass. It's a little combination of everything and best practices. And every time you read it, you'll find something different and you'll tweak it. And that's what I do every time I look at it and move things around. So at least the numbers for size, location, numbers of signs, those types of things. I tried to start with what we have because I don't want to create too many non-conforming signs, signs that already exist. Unless there's something about in the current ordinance you don't like, we want to try to keep those signs as conforming signs. Or if we're finding that there were a bunch of signs that are existing non-conforming signs that we don't have a problem with, to try to bring those into the fold and make them a conforming sign. And then the LED section, the changeable message signs, that's kind of just a shot in the dark from my perspective on that. And that's based on we had an appeal at the ZBA about the sign at Eastport Market, and there was kind of a discussion, maybe the planning commission could look at this. It wasn't ever decided that something needs to change, but I think being that the ordinance is, from the 80s, that wasn't a technology that existed at the time, and it hasn't been added in. So at least the discussion, I think, is warranted by the planning commission to determine if that's a type of sign you'd like to see in the community. You're not required to by any means, but if it is something, then we should come up with some regulations related to it. I think never mind, I'm going to stop. So I guess just start at the beginning of the section and we kind of can walk through if anybody has any comments. So we have intent and purpose, that's very broad and general. And then requirements, and this is, for when a permit's required, and kind of general. These apply to all signs, no matter if a permit's required or not required for that.
Sarah, it sounds like when you read this, though, the general requirement says permit required prior to erecting and blah, blah, blah. Zoning administrator for approval shall get a zoning permit. Does that mean every single sign has to have a permit from the zoning administrator?
Yeah, unless it's one of these signs that's listed here. And
But
so
what-
we might want to expand that when we start talking about uses. And you'll see in some of the charts, it talks about if a permit's required or not. We need to bring some of those either up to this section. So these are kind of, or maybe clarify that in addition to signs that are, tell you if you need a permit or not, these signs never need a permit.
Right, and I think you need to do that, because otherwise I read through this and I couldn't figure out where you would be able to put up a yard sign without getting a permit, which seemed ridiculous. So that, I would definitely recommend that we do that.
Sure, I can look at that. Okay. Moving on to sign measurements.
Hold on. The only thing back up in the intent and purpose under was just, one of the major themes that comes out of almost everything discussion we have with signs is around lights. I think of it like light pollution. So something in there to minimize light pollution or something like that.
Yeah.
And then I definitely agree with Barb's comments there on the permit required section.
Okay. And an item to think about too, when we're talking about signs, and this is F, and it's on page 77 of the sign section, and this is only for signs that are visible from the road right of way. Something we may want to consider is also visible from the water. That is a right of way. Or I don't know if you'd want to consider private streets. So this is only, public roads, that if you can see the sign from the public road, but if you could see it from a private street, it's not considered a sign or that has to comply with this. Or if you can see it from the water, it's not a sign that would have to comply with this.
That's a really good point. Living on a private road, as it is now, if a resident on our private road decided to create a sign, they would have to follow the same ordinances as far as, in general, a placement of signs, but the road itself, aspects of it don't apply, correct?
Well, according to this, if you can't see it from the public road, if you can only see it from the private road, they can do whatever they want. As large as they want, this whole section would not apply to them. Because it says that this requirement shall not apply that's not visible from a public right of way.
So I could put a billboard on my
Yeah,
bill, and Barb would have to drive by it
right.
and see it, and if nobody could, if people outside the woods couldn't see it, there'd be nothing there'd be
Yeah.
no way that the township could.
So I think we should include private personally. I would encourage you to include the water. It's not something that's always included, but I think just because of how much shoreline that you do have, and some of the districts that you have, that there could be a potential, for some use or somebody advertising. I don't know what they would advertise out of their house, their home business, out of the, off the water and.
No, I think it makes sense to me. What do others think about that?
Does it say that it has to be seen from public roadway?
It's item F on page 77 of the section, or it's 9 of 16 in the packet.
I don't have an F on page 77.
Near the top,
Oh, I see, I'm sorry. Shall not apply to any sign not visible from, okay, it's a double negative 3. Can we actually regulate signs on private roads?
well, I guess you would say, can I regulate a house that's on a private road if I can't regulate a sign that's on a private road? I would say yes, you can regulate it because it's kind of a public area, impacts the neighbors.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah. I mean, I'd like to see it regulated, but I'm not sure that legally you
It's a great,
can.
it's a good question.
Well, and I can ask the attorney about that.
And I
if they're
think
gonna
the
be
same thing
pushing-
on the waterways as well. I mean, it makes logical sense, but
Yeah.
it's a good question.
I can ask. If the attorney says go ahead, would you like to add those two in? I guess I should say.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
Denise is nodding.
okay.
Laura? Are you contemplating putting up a major billboard? You're on a public road. Otherwise you would.
Sorry.
Okay. I will look into that a little bit further. Next portion is sign measurements. And this talks about how we calculate the surface area of a sign and the height of a sign. This is important because this is usually what you argue over when somebody wants to put a sign up. Any concerns with this section?
Conceptually, I didn't, but in reading this, because it's so interrelated with the actual, sections that to show the different type of sign, that I almost found it more useful to spend some time on those and then coming back to see, okay, now I have a context for those different types of signs. And what does it mean to be a certain size? And like, so, because when you think you have to add them all up and this is what you get,
Yeah.
it had a different, when I read this at first and then I went to the types, I had a different perspective when I went back to it.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess this has, so you're counting either the face of the sign or if they're individual letters, you're putting a box around all of the letters to determine how big that face is. That's how you calculate that. And then, like Andy just mentioned, it's a total of all the signs of the specific type. So I'd have to look in here, but if we say you can have 3 wall signs, that equal 100 square feet, you would add them all together. They don't all have to be, 33 feet. They can be different sizes, but the total would have to be that. If it's a double-sided, so front and back, freestanding, you only count one side. But then if you start getting an angle for people to get more exposure, then you start counting both faces. So that's where it talks about item 6 there being over 90 degrees. Then you count both faces independently. Or add it together to meet your total. Then your sign height is from the grade at the base of the sign all the way to the very top of the sign. So it includes like your post and your sign face for all of it for the height. And that's probably the main parts. I'm wondering, Andy, you kind of gave me an idea as you were talking, and nobody has to make a decision tonight, but if it makes more sense to, I guess you're probably not going to read it in order. My thought is moving the types of signs further up in the chapter and then putting kind of more of the definitions and details behind it, because that's what everybody's looking for. I can also see putting the information up front, so when people are reading it, they have the context, but people don't usually read in order of what if I hand them the sign section, they flip to the charts, look through it, and then come back to figure out what that means.
I'm not sure which is the right order. I just know that it's hard. It feels hard to go from the theory of the ordinance to the practical of the signs.
Right.
And so I'm trying to think, okay, let's test it on some local businesses. What does it look like? I think of the Village Market as an example, or I'm sorry, the Eastport Market. They've, there's multiple signs and stuff out there. It would be hard. I was like, not that it would matter because they don't have this is a new ordinance, but, would they be in compliance? And if not, where and why?
Yeah. And something also that's not a part of this draft ordinance, because we didn't get that far, includes graphics. So in some places, it might be easier to show you in a graphic. So this sign area And sign height would be a spot that I would recommend creating a graphic to make it easier to show, there's words here, but it helps to visually show where those measurements are and what that looks like. So we can also add that in there as well.
What do others feel about when reviewing this and thinking through how to apply it? Was it clear to you how it works?
I think anybody just has to really study it to figure out what applies to what,
Yeah.
and hopefully they guess right. Yeah.
What are we missing when you do flip to the chart? What are we missing here where you have to flip back to something to get more information? Because it does include a lot there.
Right. Yeah, so I think this is helping to refine a little bit. Most people don't, my guess would be most people don't read this section of the ordinance. Typically somebody calls and says, hey, I want to put up a sign. What size is it? Where can I do it? Or the sign company says that. These are pretty industry standards for how you measure a sign and things like that. So there's nothing too quirky that I would say a sign company would get caught up into.
Yeah.
I'm not pushing it per se, but when I do hear it now and thinking about this further, I do like the notion of putting the standards or the kind of the types of signs up farther up so you see them. And you say, there are, how many are there? 3, 4? I guess there's 3 major categories. Putting them up, so instead of going to sign measurements and you start, okay, there are 3 types of signs, freestanding, blah, blah, blah. You put that information there along with the graphics, and then if there's any other visuals that would be helpful. And then you get into, okay, now here's the types. And then a person looking at it could look at it and say, okay, well, I'm going to be putting up some kind of a monument thing, sort of like that. But at least, boom, I can start to think about it here, and then I look through the rules. Does that make sense?
I kind of like that. I'll move it. We can look at it, and then next month we'll be like, nah, let's move it back. We'll just keep going back and forth. That's all good though. Okay, anything else about sign measurements? Okay, then we get into illumination of signs. So this is just trying to direct lighting to the sign itself. There is some details in here that's not in your current ordinance, and that's item number C that talks about the type of light and the temperature of the light. So that's something that you'll see in the draft zoning ordinance is a little bit more detail on lighting and what that looks like. Because our current ordinance doesn't have it in there, that may be a section that we don't want to carry over, as an amendment, unless you're kind of liking that and you want to continue, as we're walking through our current ordinance and making changes, thinking about that too. So what this has to do is, the measurement of lights. So the Kelvins has to do, typically LED lights have some Kelvin rating on them. The warmer colors are a lower number. 3,000 is still kind of a yellowy color. And when you get up to 5,000, it's a blue, it's a cool color. So this is keeping them a little bit warmer in color. And then talks about the 800 lumens, and that's how far, it spreads away or how bright it is from the sign itself.
I like having them there.
I love the idea of having them in there. What I can't really, here again, it goes a little bit to the practicality aspect of it. If I saw something that was a greater than this and could look at it and think, oh, yeah, we don't want something like that. But then that's my only question here. I have no concept of what's the right levels.
Yeah. And it is kind of a preference. I can tell you that because I used to work there, Garfield Township in Grand Traverse County, where the mall is and all of that, all of their lights are required to be 3,000 kelvins or less. So they're yellow. versus some different ones. You can, sometimes when you drive along South Airport, I don't know if they've changed because I haven't been on there in dark. One of the companies, one side of the road is TCL&P and the other side of the road is Cherryland or Consumers. And one of them went through and put different color light bulbs in than the other side. They might have changed it. You know, that's been 10 years ago, so anything's possible. Another thing you can do is you can look at Germany. If you look at aerial pictures of Germany at night with the lights, East Germany's yellow or blue and West Germany's the other side. I mean, I know that's not right here, you can't, but kind of just interesting to see the different colors if you go that far. Okay, well, we'll leave it for now. I mean, we can always come, when we look at it again, we can take it out or.
Yeah, that would be good. It'd be interesting if you could see if you could research. I mean, I hesitate to say this, but it's almost like if I could point to a community, and I can't right now, I have to think about it. If I could point to a community in the local area and I think, okay, when I drive through that, that seems pretty reasonable. I could see if the Torch Lake Township grew to that level, this would be kind of the lighting that I could get comfortable with. And then I drove through another community and said, don't want that. And then to try to get a sense of what the community that was more favorable that we kind of envisioned would be similar to what this might be. What types of criteria or specs would you put in to make sure that that was? So I guess it means, you know, communities around the area, you know, Northwest Lower Michigan that have these sign ordinances that we could look at as examples. And then we say, well, you know, kind of look at what they have and compare what we're proposing here. And it's like, well, is that going to mean we're going to look like that if we grow enough? Or does it mean we're going to look like that over there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, would you mind if I sent out an email and said, planning commissioners, you know, pay attention when you're driving around, what you like and don't like, and then kind of, if you can report back to me and say, hey, I saw this sign, I think it's beautiful. Can we write regulations to that? Or I saw this sign and this is what I don't like about it. Because that's kind of helpful to where you travel and what you see. That would help to have me get more information for you.
I think that would be helpful. Just say we've done that before when we were thinking, when we did our zoning revisions earlier about the building fascias and stuff. We asked questions like that. And we were thinking about different communities around. And so I think we're trying to do a similar thing like that. So yeah, please send something out for people to take a look at. And
I'll
I
just
think-
send a quick reminder. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, not a reminder for the ones that aren't here.
I guess in my mind, it hits me as like the lights in cars are more warm. And then when you come across somebody that has a new set of LEDs and how stark it is.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And you wonder if they have their bright lights on or not.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah.
Okay. Next is prohibited signs. So these are just flat out prohibited signs in general. So any animated sign. This does have built in for electronic message signs. Depending on how the planning commission wants to go with that, some of that language might change. And then these are just kind of general signs that typically we don't allow anywhere anyways.
I have a question about signs on park benches.
Mm-hmm.
Would that include like if a bench was donated in honor of someone, or, you know, sometimes they're inscribed with
Right.
someone's name or something significant, or.
Yeah, I mean, typically I would say no, because you can't read it from the road right of way. You can't really see it from the road right of way. They also have like another caveat to that, that if it's a government bench that the government puts a plaque on, the township's not required to follow your own ordinance, because that's something that's kind of unique, you know, having a plaque on it to delineate that. We could put in here, you know, leave this and then say except for.
I mean, if it's on a trail or something,
Right.
it's not on a roadway. We're
Yeah.
working to get a trail through our township, so I could foresee that maybe that would be, a way of getting benches
Yeah.
on the trail, so.
Is this trying to point out like a wrap kind of sign is what we don't like?
Yeah.
Like a bench wrap or a pole wrap,
Right.
like covering the entire thing.
Right, or where you have, we don't typically deal with this here, but not to say that you wouldn't, where you have benches that are, near the road or like at a bus stop that have advertisement on the back of the bench,
Okay,
is kind of more like kind of where that's going to.
right. Okay.
And then we get into non-conforming signs and what can happen to those non-conforming signs.
Just to back up real quick. So I'm just trying to think, and I was looking back at the definition of a sign, and the key word there is something that's advertising. But something can advertise without words on it. And then I was just starting to think like, I just want to make sure that we don't do things like if somebody, like, and I was reading the inflatable signs and somebody blows up a Santa Claus or something and it says Merry Christmas on it, is that, I guess technically, is that not a sign? And what, I mean, it's always, you don't have to enforce that, but I read that and I'm like, I don't want to get us in a spot where people can't have
Right.
a Santa Claus in front of their house.
Yeah.
So, but I guess that may violate some of those other things, so.
No, I would say, that's not, you're not advertising something, you are,
Or-
but it's a decoration.
Yes.
Something that the sign ordinance doesn't really contemplate is, art, and if art becomes a sign and advertisement, we can go
Right.
way down into that, as a way, but typically it's much broader, if it's a business, first of all, you're advertising a good, not just a decoration. There is times where you run into, some type of business that also their decoration does kind of advertise. It may be similar to a logo that they have, or say they got an inflatable sign that is their logo. Then I'd be like, well, that really is advertising and that could be a sign, So I'm not going to say every inflatable isn't, like a Christmas inflatable isn't going to end up, going into that. But typically we don't deal in that frequently. Or it's not an issue. Most people are respectful and
How many reviews or sign permits have we looked at, say, in the last 2 years?
How many what, Andy? I didn't hear you.
I'm sorry, how many applications for sign permits have we looked at in the last couple of years?
I think that I'm going to say there's very few. I'm thinking of maybe 3 or 4. I'm going to just say businesses in general, because a lot of times when people change over signs, it's because it's a new business, so they change all of them, or so they might need more than one permit. But we just don't have a large commercial area that we have that kind of sign permit need, or the changeover for sign, or new businesses that need a sign. So it's really infrequent.
Where I'm going with that is I'm just trying to think, and we're kind of plowing through this here. It's all good from that standpoint, but trying to think of like, okay, if we were to apply this now, and while pre-existing signs would, in theory, be fine, right? They're grandfathered. So if they're grandfathered, I'd be curious to see what would it change in the community? And I think, if anything, and if so, how drastic would those changes be? I think that would be a really good litmus test on this once we get through something we're getting fairly comfortable with.
Yeah, I think we can look at what's out there, and based on these regulations, my only comment to that is just because we've done it in the past doesn't mean we need to continue to do it. And I think you will find probably the largest area that we're gonna find a non-conforming issue is gonna be with freestanding signs. And I think that's because, like I was pointing out before, the one section says you can have one sign, another section says you can have two signs, but it's not specific if it's freestanding or wall signs. So, I mean, I would argue that under the current ordinance, a business technically could have 3 freestanding signs in different caliber, where going into this ordinance, this draft, I'm saying 1 freestanding sign. And like I said, it's your ordinance. You can, whatever you'd like to see in your community and regulate, but for the acreage and the amount of frontage that you have in the community, 3 signs is a lot, especially for the size that the current ordinance kind of has been giving. You know, that's why I go, okay, 1. Typically, you can have 1 freestanding, or you might be able to have a second if it's smaller, or if you have a corner lot, things like that. But, you know, also whatever you want to do. So you tell me, you know, when we get there. But we can do that, do a little bit more research and kind of say, okay, here's the number of signs, this is what it looks like.
And I agree with your comment completely that just because we have been doing doesn't mean we should continue to do so. But on the flip side, if we apply it and, you know, it doesn't make sense that the person's not going to be able to advertise their business in an effective way at all,
Right.
especially with the lighting restrictions. I mean, we don't want to be so overly conservative that it's hard for businesses to mark because people are kind of cruising through at 45 or 50 miles an hour and they won't see. And, you know, and that's not good either. So
I agree.
it's a reasonableness.
Yep.
Can we back up a second to the 0555 prohibited signs? Under B, they're flashing signs. I would rather just see them prohibited rather than depending on the illumination and whether it's the same on as it is off and, you know, whatever all is contained in here. I don't think we need that, especially when we're not allowing animated signs. And then to have that as an exception doesn't make sense to me.
I'm trying to just track with you. Are you saying B up towards the top of page 78,
Page 78, the
middle?
Yeah, it's number 3.
animated
On-
signs.
Okay.
Flashing. Yeah,
The
and
3 under there is flashing, and I just don't think we need to have flashing signs. I mean, you could have, this does not prohibit the use of electronic message signs, okay? So then those would be flashing. But I don't know why you would need to otherwise have flashing signs. Because then you get into, you know, the amount of illumination, the speed of repetition of the cycles.
I think I agree with what you're saying, but I'm trying to make sure I understand it. So basically, we're saying we don't want flashing
Related
signs,
to-
right?
Right,
And then this gets into the definition of it.
right.
So, and it says basically if the cycle is 1 hour, exceeds 1 hour, it's not flashing.
right.
If the cycle's less than 1 hour, it could be viewed as flashing.
And I guess that would
Okay.
change based on when we get to the discussion about electronic message signs, because those messages change and there is a period of time, you know, even though it's instantaneous, you know, a new message appears, is that considered flashing or not? So this section may be much easier and streamlined if there's no electronic message signs. Or we can move some of that language maybe into that area of the ordinance as well. So I'll mark that as something maybe to clean up or to clarify or streamline or,
Yeah, I would think my personal opinion would be to preclude flashing signs, not get into how often it cycles or whatever, except there's no prohibition against permitted electronic message signs. I mean, I would keep those, but I wouldn't have other signs that flash.
Okay.
And flash is
Yeah.
kind of the operative word, you know, because I don't consider those, the electronic message signs, they aren't really flashing. The
Right.
picture changes every so often, but I don't see those as flashing. I mean, flashing I kind of see as, you know,
Right.
this sort of thing.
Right. Yeah, let me work on that language a little bit.
Okay.
So then getting into non-conforming signs, we touched on that a little bit. So non-conforming signs, you can replace the face of a non-conforming sign. So if a business changes name or a use, they are able to use the existing, say, frame of a sign, replace the face of it for that new business. That is allowed on a non-conforming sign. But if it's destroyed, or it's discontinued, you know, for a period of time or things like that, then just like we deal with most other nonconformities, for that. And then we get into the removal of signs at certain times. So, you know, this is kind of more about enforcement, notification of any signs that we find. It's kind of a catch-all area that helps to clean those items up.
Going back to non-conforming signs, item D. I understand, I believe, what we're trying to do there. I don't know, it seems that particular criteria seems, it says it's determined by the zoning administrator. It seems like you could get sideways with somebody pretty easily on that. It could be so easy to argue that and debate it up, down, and sideways.
Yeah.
It seems to me like maybe it is like if the thing gets flattened by a giant windstorm and it costs them a bunch of money to put it back, as long as they apply and can stick with the other aspects of this ordinance. I mean, I guess what are we trying to accomplish with that?
That if it's damaged, if somebody hits the sign, somebody's driving down the road and knocks your sign out and it levels it and it destroys it, so you have to have a whole new sign built, you have to comply with the ordinance, size, location, number. So if you have 3 signs, we only allow you 1, you can't replace that unless you take your other signs down. You know, you may get downtone. It's like, you know, right now, say you had 3 signs on your property, we knock 1 down, you're only allowed to have 1, you can't put that back up. Or say somebody knocks down your sign, but they don't run it over. So you do need to just bring a crane and put it back in. Then you could put it back where it was, potentially, because that's not going to cost.
So, but this one says that you can reestablish it.
Right, if it doesn't exceed the 50% cost.
So is the question, is it the zoning administrator that determines that cost? Or do we need to say, or I would say that you get the quote or whatever and then provide it to the zoning administrator and they're the ones that would then approve.
What I would do is I would have them provide me a quote for the work they want to do, and then I'd call a couple other sign companies and see if they agree with that to make sure that that's an accurate representation.
Yeah.
I will tell you that there's not a good way to do it. This will always be a sticking point in the ordinance for somebody that has a sign that's damaged. The only way that you can, the cleanest way to do it is to say if your sign is damaged or removed for any reason, it has to comply when you replace it. That's the easiest, cleanest way to do it, because there's none of this figuring out what the fee is. But I'm also, you know, there may be situations where somebody has a sign and something happens. For instance, when MDOT comes through and they need to put it, or a utility comes through and needs to put a utility in, and they pull your sign out and it's non-conforming, No, I'm telling you that they pulled your sign and you can't put it back because it's been removed. So even though I am a zoning administrator, I do, have enough of a heart that really kind of bothers me. So we're trying to build in provisions,
Well, and that's where my struggle is with that one, because somebody comes in and buys a business with a non-conforming sign, and they like the look and feel of the business, and they come in, and I suppose it's, buyer beware that, to understand the law, but I guess it concerns me that, your sign gets flattened by the snowplow, and too bad, so sad. If somebody really didn't like your sign, they might be willing to just accidentally knock it down with their truck, and then it just seems wrong to me. But maybe if I'm the only one that feels that way, then I'll move on. But it feels like an artificial penalty against somebody, like, for damage that may not be, that's obviously not intended.
Right. No, I agree. Or, tornado comes through and takes out your sign. It's Mother Nature. That's act of God, I guess you could say. And you're kind of penalized for it. At the same time, we have an ordinance that you're trying to get compliance with, and, maybe clean up clutter or size or location. Things change over time. So, that's an opportunity for us to get that into compliance.
Maybe if you just flag that one, because to me, that's a big one, but it's big in the sense that it has far-reaching impacts to somebody.
I'm okay with it.
You're okay with it?
I'm okay with it.
How about others?
I'm wondering how that compares for, if something happened to a non-compliant building and they had to replace, they would have to comply, right?
Yeah. I'd have to go back and read the non-conforming section exactly to see what it is, because that is in a different part for buildings and structures for non-conformity and how we deal with those. I will say, there's opportunity to go to the Zoning Board of Appeals, and usually, buildings and like use of land and structures definitely have a bigger, are easier to meet the criteria for the Zoning Board of Appeals than a sign. So you could say somebody, and I don't want to say just tell them to go to the ZBA. Like that's the answer. That fixes it for you, right, Andy? Like send it to the ZBA. I don't want to tell you to do that because I hate setting things up in that way, that you're just relying on the ZBA to make the decision. I'd rather deal with it in the zoning ordinance. But, signs just are a little bit more kind of discretionary, and they don't take up as much space. They usually can comply easier. So I'm not really comfortable say, oh yeah, those signs that got hit by a car, let us go to the ZBA, they'll approve them. Because they really shouldn't. They're not going to meet the criteria. Where a structure, you may have a better opportunity to meet the criteria.
What would be the percentage if you were the business owner where, if that happened, that you would say, oh, here's the quote? Would it be 75%? Would it be 90? At what point would you say, you know what? It's time.
I'm just thinking of like, suppose we pass all of this, or not, we're not going to tonight, obviously, but suppose we get through this and take the biggest store we have in town, Eastport Market, and bang, tornado comes through, takes out, and that, and flattens it. I'm not even sure what signs there would meet or not meet this, but, I would hate to see a business owner like that not be able to kind of resurrect the business the way it was, in compliance with the lighting in particular. But it's probably more around the size and things of that nature than it is the lighting. Sure, if it gets flattened and all of a sudden they come in and put fancy lights because our new ordinance doesn't reflect addressing that would be different. But if it's in the spirit of, and that's the same size, it just feels a little bit more heavy-handed. But I get where it's at, and so we should let it sit for now and bring it back up later.
And maybe some of that'll help get addressed if we can go through and do kind of like the site survey of what's out there.
Yes.
And you'll say, okay, there's 3 signs we're worried about, and not to say they're not important, but is it 3 or is it 80?
Yep.
that would be non-conforming. Okay. So removal of unsafe, unlawful, and abandoned signs, any comments over those?
Are there any signs on the old Peterson's building or what used to be Riccardi's and then 31 North? Is it all gone now?
Are they gone?
All gone?
There's a marquee sign out front, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good example. That's number one. We can use that picture.
Okay. So moving on to permit application approval process, this is 5.5.8. That's from the proposed draft ordinance, so I'll update those sections, but I didn't want to go through that if you were gonna scratch language. So this is just for permit application, what's required to be on the application and how you get a permit. So this is pretty consistent with the existing requirements in how we treat a sign permit. I think that it helps lay it out a little bit more than in the current ordinance to help out the zoning office. And a permit's good for 1 year.
Is that what it currently is?
Yes. Ready to move on to freestanding signs? Okay. So freestanding signs, hopefully, the definition that's here helps you to figure out what type of signs we're talking about. And then also the picture helps to also, give an example of that, just to help everybody to get to what it is. In this ordinance, we don't have a lot of different types of signage, so it's a little bit easier, but sometimes, like freestanding, and then you get monuments, so is it a pole sign or what that looks like? Freestanding sign. So this talks about the district they're allowed in, so each of the zoning districts. So I will need to update this to reflect what our current ordinance has for districts, but then talks about the maximum area for square footage. And like I said, I tried to start kind of with what's currently in here for allowed for commercial signage and work from that. So currently in the zoning ordinance, a business identification sign that's allowed in village business, village residential, commercial, manufacturing, and PRD and PUD zoning districts. You're allowed one sign that's 50 square foot. It has to be half of the required setback for that district. And it does talk about planning commission allowing some variation from that. And this is where the current ordinance talks about advertising and display signs. That allows for 2 signs, 25 square foot each, same zoning districts, half the area. So, and the reason I have freestanding signs, say in the ag district or in the residential districts, is we do allow for some commercial uses that might get approved in those zoning districts. So in the ag district, you could have a farm market or something, they should be able to have signage. So that's why it comes into there. But, it'd have to be an approved use to get a sign as well. So that's why you see some of those throughout. The current ordinance does not talk about, 20 feet in height is the height restriction for the current ordinance. So this has a 10-foot height instead of a 20-foot height. So, I'm sure you'll want to talk about that a little bit. It's kind of nice to come down closer to the ground because you kind of get closer to that monument sign. But it's all about the aesthetics that you'd like to have, 10 versus 20, and what that looks like.
I prefer the lower personally, but what is it? Seems like 10 feet in the monument kind of aspect, because when I do think of areas you go through, when it's lower and a little more obscure in that regard, it fits in a little better than, 10 feet's still pretty tall.
I mean, when you think about when you're in a car and when you're driving along, your kind of line of sight and what that looks like and height. And I mean, I get, the further you're away, the greater you might be able to see a sign. But when everybody has a sign at 20 feet, you can only see the one that's closest to you anyways, type of thing.
Do others agree on that? Because that's kind of a big thing as far as height. Yep.
Okay. And then wall signs is the other type of sign that we're talking about. So these are signs, they're within 12 inches of a building wall. If they're further out than that, I don't know what we'd consider them. You'd say you can't have it, I guess. Maybe it'd be a pole sign, I'm not sure, or a freestanding sign. So this allows 20% of the facade not to exceed 25 square feet. So you could break it up in however many signs you wanted, as long as it doesn't exceed 25 square feet. The current ordinance does not, it doesn't talk about the types of signs. So this business identification sign right now that talks about one sign, 50 square feet in this district, that could be a wall sign. It could be a freestanding sign under the current ordinance. Same with the advertising and display. It doesn't break down the difference between the two. So this is probably one of the bigger differences, is separating out those two types of signage and the use of them. Any
In
thoughts?
the revision that we did to the ordinance, I don't remember the number, but it had with the facades and the building sizes and stuff. What was the maximum height that we said? Do you remember?
It's more than that. It's going to be like 35, 40.
Yeah, I was just trying to get a sense. Is this,
me
so this
look.
is less than half as high as the building,
Yeah.
which,
I mean, you could say if you wanted to, just as long as it can't be higher than the wall of the building, if you want to allow them to put it anywhere on there.
no, I'm not disagreeing with it or even, I'm just trying to get a conceptual view of what it might look like. If you took the maximum size of a building fascia you could have and you said, okay, given that this is as high up as your sign can go, does that even make logical sense?
Yeah.
I think it does, but
So it's 41 feet from the peak to the grade. And that is in the commercial zoning district. So because it goes from the peak, I mean, if you had a flat roof, your wall could be, 40 feet. But if you have some sort of a peak, well, depends on which way the peak faces, how big your wall is.
so you could have a very large roof and a pretty low sign. But I wouldn't change it for now unless somebody else thinks it should be higher. Because we're saying that the freestanding sign can be only 10 feet.
Okay.
You could envision somebody deliberately creating a very tall structure just so they can stuff the sign as high up as
Right.
big as possible. Of course, they would be limited on square footage size, but
Right.
still.
I mean, because the size is limited to 25 square feet, realistically, they're probably not going to put it too high. You're going to try to get it at kind of eye level or around that. It may not be that big of an issue. I think if especially if you want to say just it can't sit above the wall, but you can mull it over a little bit more. And then the last signs section that I have in here, but not the last one we're going to talk about, is small temporary signs. So this goes back to, typically this is the part that everybody hates, because when you're looking at content neutral and you are looking at, say, political signs, people have a right, freedom of speech, to put political signs in their yard, which is a temporary sign. So you need to allow some avenue for that. But we can't regulate the message that's on the sign. So they could put up a temporary sign in their yard that is not political. I'm trying to think of an example right now.
Could you put a temporary sign that had like severe profanity on it? What would restrict that?
There's not a lot. It would depend on your attorney and what they're willing to fight, because signs run right into freedom of speech. So you end up, it has a higher threshold when you're fighting in court about it. And you end up usually in like a federal court instead of a local court, because it's protected under the US Constitution. So, I mean, I've had attorneys, there's signs or flags that, are related to the political parties from the last election and posted in very public places where kids may even be around. And, I've been informed by attorneys, don't touch it. They have a right to express themselves. And I guess because it's a word and it's not an image, maybe there may be more of an image you could run into where you'd say that's not appropriate to be on a sign. But we, as government, people's freedom of speech is protected. And so it is a difficult thing. So, you could put a sign up in your yard that says, I hate my neighbor. And it's a temporary sign, it's 8 square feet, and they're protected. They can do that.
Look away.
Mm-hmm. So this allows for 8 square feet and as many signs as you can have to 8 square feet. So if it wanted to be, 8 1 square foot signs, that's something that's, you can do. 1 8 foot, 8 square feet, 2 4, however you want to break that down. So that does allow some flexibility as far as political or real estate signs, for that. Thoughts on temporary signs?
Well, the temporary, we've really stretched that definition, I think, or enforcement, because there's signs that have been up for 2 years, that-
Right. So are you looking for maybe
I'm not
Better-
saying that we need to do anything different, but the whole idea of temporary signs,
yeah.
it's,
See, and I agree. When does temporary become permanent and what's that look like? And that's one of the things like related to political signs where I think even the state has some regulations that talk about being removed a certain amount of time after an election.
Yep.
But then I've also been advised, and maybe it had to do with this sign thing, is that that's somebody's right to freedom of speech. If they dislike the results of the election, that they can still have a political sign in their yard for as long as they want. So that's why it's going, okay, what's a temporary sign? What's a permanent sign for that?
So on the application where it says they have to have a specific start and end date,
Mhm.
it's just a year, up to a year. If they want to do it for 3 months, they can limit themselves when they apply, or?
Yeah, and I'm wondering. In temporary signs, typically you're looking at like this, a lot of time talks about like grand opening signs more so than your sign you're going to put in your yard. Because I don't know that I'd want to require a permit for everybody to put up, during election time type of thing. So I think if this language, you bring that up, is something I need to look at a little bit more too. But I don't know that we could. Let me see if there's a balance. I'm not saying that I know you're not saying necessarily there's a problem or you'd want to regulate that, but I think that it is also important to when does one's temporary sign, and maybe more specifically to a business, if they're saying I'm only limited to one freestanding sign, I can have temporary signs, but your temporary signs are acting like permanent signs at your business. What's that look like from an enforcement perspective? Because we want to make it as clear to everybody what that could be.
So where is duration introduced in here for a temporary sign?
The only time that it mentions it is Laura just pointed out it's on page 80, talks about for your sign permit, it's item 8, talks about a temporary sign shall have a specific start and end date. But otherwise, the definition for temporary sign just says a non-permanent sign displayed for a limited duration or time, not intended to be a permanent display.
Okay, so that's, I see how it connects now. So basically, that means it's putting all the burden on the zoning administrator and the permit to decide, if I want to put up a temporary sign and define it as 5 years, I could put it on the permit application, and you would have to say no. And then I would argue and say, well, what do you use? And can't we say something like we can define it as 180 days or something like that? I mean, what?
Let me ask.
A lot of the temporary signs are things that they have a definite, they speak to a definite event or something that's happening on a particular date. So, like yard signs. I don't know.
Yeah.
Garage sales, that kind of thing. We could have something in here that says that as soon as the event's over, you have, so many days to take it down. That would be one thing you could do. I think we do need to flesh out what does temporary mean a little bit better.
How do you determine if it's
Maybe it's
abandoned?
not intended to be permanent. I mean, how do you know whether it's intended to be permanent or not? You'd have to be a mind reader.
It is hard. I mean,
But
Let
I think
me-
if you define a little better what a temporary sign is, if it speaks to a certain event on a particular day, then within 3 days of that event having taken place, it has to be removed. That kind of thing.
okay.
Do we define what makes an abandoned sign? Thank you. So could you just throw it under that?
Like if it were abandoned because it's been up for 180 days or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I
so
like that definition.
we were saying that we don't necessarily want to require a permit for those temporary signs.
Right.
Is that, so we would add that then to the,
Yeah, and
to that
see, you'll see
section.
at the edge of this is one of those, at the edge of the chart here, it says permit required, and they're all marked no for temporary signs versus wall signs. And the freestanding signs say, yes, a permit is required.
okay. We just don't have it
So
called
I'll
out under
clarify
that
that.
section above?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the last type of sign I would like to talk about are electronic message signs, and the planning commission's thoughts on if you would like to allow that type of sign or not.
I like them.
Yes.
Yes.
Talking about like the billboards where it
Yeah, where they can-
flashes the different
Yep, where the message is changed.
businesses or messages of whatever.
Yeah, where Eastport Market had one up for a little while at their spot. But, for a while, technology, it's very expensive technology, and the prices have definitely come down. So there's more interest in allowing that. Some communities are either, really supportive of them. They find it a way for people to advertise. It's new technology, it's something creative. You don't have to go out in the weather. Other communities find them to be kind of a nuisance and, too bright and
Distraction.
Yep. And if you have too many, if every business on the strip has one and they're all changing, what does that look like? So those are all considerations when you're thinking about it. And we can regulate, the lighting and require after dark them to be dimmed. You can require different colors too. So you could say you can't use like a white background because people can't read it anyways, typically. But if as a business you can't figure that out, we can tell them, no white background, especially at night at full speed, full brightness, because you can't read that. And You can also require them to be shut off at certain times if you want to. You know, here in Torch Lake, there's a lot of the commercial businesses are located near residential properties. So if that's a concern, you know, I have a friend that lives right next to a school. The school has an LED sign, but they shut it off after 11 p.m. Just for the color. But they also kind of make a little bit of a noise. They hum if you're close enough to them. So that's always an option too, if you want to go that way. And then the frequency of how often they change. And if you want the message to be animated, because Barbara kind of mentioned that flashing, but you know, do you want somebody to be able to have a flag that waves on it, or do you want it to be a static message the whole time that it's being displayed? So all things to kind of consider. But before we go down all of that, we need to decide if we want to talk about them some more or not.
Are we talking about business residential areas as well as?
It would be, I would say anywhere that you could have a freestanding sign, you could have that. But I can also make the argument that they're not allowed in like the ag district or your residential district. So it would be a separate chart and you would get to call out the zoning districts that it is allowed in. So if you want to say it's only allowed in the commercial district, that's the only place they could have that type of
I'm
sign.
just thinking our hamlets are pretty densely populated.
Mhm.
But our business district, like where I guess where the market is,
Mhm.
Eastport Market, is that?
That's village business, you know, that's in the
Okay.
village. I mean, you could say, you could say it needs to be on, you know, like an MDOT road, but that takes you down M88, which is across from residential. That doesn't really solve that problem. You could say, I guess, that it has to be along 31. But then you can run into, you know, the little village, not Eastport, the one closer, Torch Lake.
Torch
Torch
Lake.
Lake Village.
Yeah, Torch Lake. That, you know, that's very residential. There's not a lot of commercial there. That's zone village business as well as, you know, further up on the corner. So, you know, all things to consider.
Mhm.
So if we did decide that we wanted to allow that, then we got to figure out what the requirements are around it.
Right. You're going to tell me to wait for a full planning commission,
Yeah,
aren't you?
absolutely. I was gonna say, those others aren't getting away from that one. So why don't we park that? I think we've accomplished quite a bit tonight. It's given us some good context. And Sarah, you have some things you can come back and you're gonna shift around these definitions and bring them more forward. You've got lots of areas to redraft, and then we can take another cut at it when
Yeah.
we get the other group.
I'll throw one thing out there on signs, just as a thought, brainstorming here, ways that you could use it. One of the reasons why I like it is maybe the day park is full. It's so full, and maybe the people there are really annoyed that people keep driving down there. Driving down there and turning around and causing us commotion, and it's already full. It's enough hectic craziness for the day. Sign at the end of the road, full, don't bother, turn around, boom.
Yeah.
There's a million ways to use them, but
Yeah, no, there's no question that they could have uses, and there could be, if we've determined that we were not going to enable them, and there could be some unintended consequences of a use that could be very valuable. So, and the same thing goes for businesses. So it's not a, you know, it's definitely got its challenges with how to think about it. So that's why I think I'd like to see more commission members here for that discussion.
You know, and I'll put that in that little homework email to you to kind of think about it as you're driving around and you're looking at signs, you know, electronic message signs, and communities that have them and don't have them, or ones that you like, what you like about it. Because maybe there's, or you don't like something that we could pull in based on that. So, okay, we'll pick up there.
So anything else on our new business section? Well, we have So, well, let me back up. Any other questions or thoughts on the signs for this evening?
I think that the 8 square feet on the temporary signs, I think it's too much. I mean, because when you were saying you can have 8 square feet, and so that could be, 4 or 8 different signs lined up together across the front of your property, I think it gets to be way too much. I mean, if you're going to put up a political sign, that's fine, but don't put up, 8 of them in a row because you can.
So we could say, that if you're concerned about that, we could also say you can only, we could limit the number. So if you wanted to say 8 and you can have 3, or go a smaller square foot, we could go either way on that.
I'd go with a smaller square foot, and then I would also say that they cannot be, that you cannot use more than one to convey one particular message. In other words, if you have no, it's, you can put up whatever you want, but you can't, the number of signs is what you're limiting.
Yeah. Okay, I'll look and see what I can find.
Okay.
So just to summarize, once again, Sarah's going to make these revisions. We're going to get our next planning commission group together and take another crack at this, another review of it. You'll have a chance to reflect on it. Sarah, you're also going to send out some thoughts as far as requests for the planning commission members to keep their eyes out,
Yeah.
look at different examples, things you like, things you don't like. Bring those through for the discussion.
Yeah, and we'll do that. We can have a tight turnaround because this meeting's a week later, so we lost a week before the next meeting. So we'll do the best we can, but I think that,
Sure.
Just whatever discussion we can have on this section next month would be great.
So the other item we had for tonight was the 2023 meeting calendar. I thought we talked about that.
No, we've never formally adopted a calendar
Ah.
for this year, so every year we have to adopt one. So this is suggesting that everything stay the same as we have, second Tuesday at 7 PM. We did talk about moving it to 6 o'clock at one time? Maybe that was last year.
We did, and then we also had a lot of talk in our last short meeting around this meeting, and then
Right.
then that led to some discussion around when we could get a better attendance.
Yeah, so I think we were talking about it. I think it's already been a year after a lot of the new members were on there, what time it was. So this proposed schedule is the same as it was for 2022, second Tuesday at 7 PM in this room is what's being proposed.
I'd make a motion that we accept that list of dates that was given to us as our regular meeting dates and time.
I second it.
Discussion? Yeah, I don't have any better alternatives, so they're always challenging anyway. It seems to get worse when we try to change it. So all in favor?
Aye.
Okay, moving on to unfinished business. Sarah, did we have anything unfinished that we need to address?
There is nothing for unfinished.
Okay, moving on to concerns of the commission. From the chair, I'd say I thought our process and discussion tonight was very good. Appreciate the input from all the planning commission members, and thank you, Sarah, for your guidance on this. I'd say definitely need, especially as it relates to this and all these, to try to get as many of the commission members together as possible and miss having the other input. It's noticed because it feels different. I would say the other thing is that I thought you had referred in here somewhere, but then I lost track of it. Sarah, you had mentioned the, kind of sequentially going through pieces of this document, the next highest priority. What were those?
Yeah, so on the memo that was with that section of the zoning ordinance, I did put together some items that I don't have them in order of importance here in this list, but to talk about the cottage industry, medical marijuana, wineries, meaderies, cideries, the uses in the zoning districts with their supplemental kind of use and standards, the zoning ordinance amendment. We kind of had talked about that a little bit. The criteria for a zoning ordinance amendment, home occupation, home-based businesses. It's really in the cottage industry, those two together, it's very difficult to kind of enforce and define the line between all of those businesses and what that looks like. So people call and say, is this a home occupation? And you're going, well, what that looks like. So to clear up that language. And then the waterfront regulations, we had talked about what the high water mark was, kind of talked about putting that off until going through the draft. So looking at that, and the draft does have more waterfront regulations as far as buffering and plantings and things like that, because the Planning Commission did hear from soil erosion, the drain commissioner 2 years ago. She was here maybe. I can't remember now. And it was kind of interest of doing something to help the lake and runoff, stormwater runoff and that. So the draft ordinance does have a little bit more language than our current ordinance has related to that. There was something else that just came up the other day that I was like, oh, need to add that to the list as being an issue too.
So maybe the other aspect that I'd like to get the commission's views is that I would like you to benefit from, I had the opportunity to speak with Steve. I think it would be beneficial to everyone here I could have him draft up his thoughts to those questions that I'd pose at the beginning of the meeting tonight. Could also have him share his perspective on, to start with, we could have him share his perspective on the signs piece of it as well. I don't think having these extra sets of eyes on this hurt. And like I said, it gave me more context. And then, and bring that to the next meeting. I think that'd be pretty easy to do. Would that be beneficial? Okay. Do you agree with that?
I kind of like the already review what would happen next week.
Okay.
I
But
mean,
he didn't provide the context, which I think would be really helpful.
So you're looking kind of for his reasoning. I can work with you on that too. Do you want him to take a look specifically at the sign section? I mean, when he kind of was looking at it, it was over the sections as we were going through them. So the steering committee had a list and we went through Article 1, 3, and 4 together, for example. And we went through different sections. So he read it as broken up into sections, and it was chapters at a time, having him look specifically at the sign section, just as one section to narrow in on. I mean, I don't have a problem. It doesn't bother me. I like having the additional eyes because then when later on we can go, everybody missed it instead of Sarah missed it.
Yeah, no, I think it would be beneficial. I don't think it'd be that hard for him to do that.
Okay. Did he agree to do that when you talked to him? Or we just?
Yes, he seemed,
we
yeah,
just committed
he's
him
very,
to-
he's very open to, yes,
Okay.
to help in any way he can.
Nice.
Oh, sure. But I think
Okay.
he's busy enough. He doesn't need the work. That's pretty clear. So he's kind of part-time these days. So, any concerns of other commission members? What is this?
This is the one that Alan handed out.
Yes. Yes, I think he sent it to,
He emailed it to the planning commissioners. He didn't email it to the office.
yes, so you should have gotten it before, but I can forward it to you.
It
That's
came
easy.
from him.
Absolutely. Yep. Sure. Absolutely. I can forward it to you. Easy.
Well, and it could have just been his list on the website. We just say to email the office, and then we distribute out. So to make sure everybody does get it.
Anything else? Sarah, do you have any concerns?
No, thank you for taking a look at this section and spending time on it and working through it. And,
Yep. Thank you for putting it together. I'm anxious to see the next examples that you come up with.
Yeah.
So I think now we can move into public comment. If there are any members of the public that would like to come forward, please state your name and state your comments. Oh.
All right, first thing, good start. I guess it's not going to be easy, is it? I mean, when I said a year, there's a lot here. Second thing, if you want Steve, even if you wanted him to go through and redline a section of that, we've got funds available in this budget year to take care of any of his fees. The budget was due on 1/16. That was a question back to that.
Oh.
I took your number of the number of meetings, I added 3. So,
It's probably a good idea.
yeah. So you'll have, I think that's a total of 15 for the next calendar year. And Laura, I'm glad you were part of the steering committee so you can let them know what we've gone through and let them understand that we were not going to step on the toes of the planning commission. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Hearing no more public comments this evening. Any other comments for could I have a motion to adjourn tonight's meeting?
I was just going to say, Bill, can I get your card before you leave, please, sir? Oh, you got it? Thank you. I apologize. Thank you. What's, I normally hand it over to her, yeah. Thank you. Now I'd like to make the motion to adjourn the meeting.
All in favor? Aye.
It's 9:08.
Meeting adjourned.